In this video, I'm going to briefly outline the computer crimes provisions in Australian Commonwealth legislation. There are many different crimes in the Commonwealth Criminal Code that relate to the use of computers or computer networks. Some of these, for example, make it a criminal offence under Commonwealth law to use a telecommunications network with intent to create another serious offence, or to make a threat, or to menace, harass, or offend other people. In this video, however, I want to talk mainly about crimes against computer systems. In particular, these are unauthorised access, or what we might know as hacking, and denial of service or impairment of communications or systems. The Commonwealth legislation is based off and modelled from the International Cybercrime Convention. This convention attempts to make a uniform approach to the international regulation of criminal behaviour concerning computer networks. The first series of crimes that I want to talk about is unauthorised access, or computer trespass. This is what colloquially we might know of as hacking, breaking into a system without authorisation in order to access either the system itself or the data that it contains. This is prohibited by both a serious offence in section 477.1, punishable by 10 years imprisonment, and a less serious offence, punishable by 2 years imprisonment in section 478.1. The serious offence requires intent to gain access, knowledge that access is unauthorised, and importantly, the intent to commit another serious offence. So this provision applies where an attacker gains access to a system in order to commit another crime. The definition of serious offence here means an offence that is punishable by greater than 5 years imprisonment. For all other acts of unauthorised access, the less serious offence applies, with a maximum penalty of 2 years imprisonment. This only requires knowledge that access is unauthorised and an intent to gain access or modify restricted data. And restricted data is defined as any data within a computer that is protected by some form of access control system. So the serious offence in 477.1 applies when an attacker breaks into a computer system in order to commit another serious offence. In all other cases, where someone gains access to a computer system or modifies data that is held in a computer system, the less serious offence in 478.1 applies with a maximum of 2 years imprisonment. The second serious offence is 477.2. This is the offence of unauthorised modification of data in order to cause impairment. This is also punishable by 10 years imprisonment. This one requires knowledge that modification of data held within a computer is unauthorised, some intent to modify that, and recklessness as to whether or not the modification does in fact impair that data or impair access to the data or system. So this offence applies when someone breaks into a system in order to modify the data that is held there, but only where that modification would cause an impairment to the access of data, to its reliability, security, or operation, which is pretty broad in effect. So this is a 10-year maximum penalty offence for breaking into a system and changing, without authorisation, the data that it contains. Next, we have a series of offences that deal not with gaining access to a system necessarily, but of disrupting communications to it. So, for example, these provisions apply to denial of service attacks, which are designed to flood a computer system or network with so many requests that legitimate traffic cannot get through. The penalty provision here is section 477.3. Again, this is a serious offence with a maximum penalty of 10 years imprisonment. The fault elements are that the offence requires knowledge that the impairment was unauthorised, intent to cause that impairment, and recklessness as to whether or not the system was actually impaired. For all of these provisions, unauthorized mean that a person is not entitled to access, modify, or impair access to a system. Importantly though, just because someone has an ulterior purpose for accessing or impairing communications does not mean that they are unauthorized. So if someone has legitimate rights to access a server or information on that system, they may not be caught under the definition of unauthorized access. Importantly, there's still a grey area here as to when exceeding the access that one is permitted to have to a computer system will become unauthorized access. For each of these Commonwealth offences, where they do not explicitly state the fault elements that apply, the default fault elements in section 5.6 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code apply. This means that except where explicitly stated, all of these offences require intent to do the act, whether that's to access, to modify the data, or to cause impairment. They also need recklessness as to whether or not the data was actually modified or access was actually impaired. Historically, these offences only applied where the Commonwealth had jurisdiction, that is, either over telecommunication systems or in relation to Commonwealth networks. Following the introduction and ratification of the Cybercrime Convention, the Commonwealth gained jurisdiction under its foreign affairs power to regulate more broadly. The legislation was accordingly amended and now applies to all conduct in Australia or conduct against Australian computer systems where the attacker is overseas, or where the attacker is an Australian citizen or an Australian entity or corporation. This means that there is now some overlap with state laws, where conduct will be prohibited under both state and federal law. There is a savings provision in the law, which means that state law will still apply if conduct is not unlawful under federal law. The final offence I want to talk about is interception. Interception refers, as the name implies, to unlawfully gaining access to the communications that are passing over a communications network. This offence is not found in the Criminal Code, but instead in the Telecommunications Interception and Access Act 1979 Commonwealth under Section 7. The TIAA provides that it is an offence with a maximum of 2 years imprisonment to intercept a communication. This includes not only direct interception, but authorizing or permitting another to intercept, or doing anything that helps the person or another person to intercept communications that are passing over a communication system. This is an important provision that prevents people from accessing the communications that pass over the various systems on the internet. Remember that the internet is a big federated network of networks. Anyone with access to any of the networks over which a communication is routed could theoretically gain access to the content of that communication. The TIAA prevents people from gaining access to content of communications that are passing over their networks or tapping into other networks in order to gain access to that content. All of these offences have exceptions that apply to law enforcement agencies and security personnel. They also have exceptions that apply for people who are carrying on their legitimate duties as part of an operator of a telecommunications network or system. If you look further into the Criminal Code, you'll see that there are a host of other computer offences too. These include 478.2, the unauthorized impairment of data held on a computer disk. There are also prohibitions on possessing or supplying the information or tools that are required in the commission of a criminal offence.